Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Awaken Empowered podcast. I'm Micheila Sheldan. I'm here with Ethan Fox, and the hot topic today is extraterrestrials. So we figured we would dedicate this episode to all things extradimensional, which is a really interesting topic because we can take it in so many different directions. And I think the top of everybody's mind right now is when is disclosure going to happen? Which personally, I think is already taking place on so many different levels. And to begin, I just want to mention I did not believe in extraterrestrials at all. Really, throughout my entire life, I was not involved in this conversation. I didn't even think about extraterrestrials being real until I had my awakening and started to meditate and actually began speaking to them. And one of the first collectives that came in to speak to me was the Pleiadians. And actually, I want to step back and say, I think when we break open to these ideas of extraterrestrials and contact and communication, it tends to start in various levels. So for me, my first awakening to spirit was a guide named Jacob, who I felt was really an earthly kind of angelic being, very grounded, on my level. And he spoke to me that way and really opened the door to a variety of other teachers, masters, ascended masters, those types of familiar beings. But later I found out that Jacob was more interdimensional than I actually thought that he was. And truly we all are. So if we've led many, many lifetimes throughout the galaxy and even beyond this universe, we have to consider that the beings that show up, and as we show up, we're filtering all that energy and all that information through our consciousness. So in a sense, we are all a part of the extraterrestrial communities that we so desperately want to speak to and also hear from, here on planet Earth. But when I think about extraterrestrial contact, the first thing I think about is my own experience, where something appeared to me, began speaking to me in a very etheric way that I had no knowledge of and actually had to go Googling. So when the Pleiadians presented themselves to me, I'd never heard that word. It was something I wasn't familiar with at all. And the messages were pretty otherworldly, taking earthly concepts and things that I had never put into a higher consciousness framework and explaining them to me in terminology even that I wasn't familiar with. And so many people today are having, these profound awakenings to extraterrestrials and to spirit. And sometimes we don't even know who it is. And I get many clients today who come to me and say, somebody is speaking to me, but I can't qualify who they are. I can't get a name. I can't understand what collective it is. And many of us are even oriented now to gathering energy and information from many different beings and locations at once, which, I definitely do in my channeling. But I think it's interesting to start with multidimensional energy because to me, everything actually exists in the room and the space that we're in. So we imagine these extraterrestrials to be off in the galaxy somewhere else on Pleiades, on Sirius, on Arcturus, and all of these different planets and star systems. And they are physically, of course, but if we exist in a quantum reality, then we have tangible access in a metaphysical sense to everything in our space, which includes so much that we cannot see. So before we can actually expect disclosure in a more physical and even governmental way, which I'm not sure I believe is really going to happen in the way people are expecting, we have to come to terms with the fact that we are all telecommunicating with energy in our own unique and specific way. And we are the ambassadors for that disclosure also in very unique ways.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is interesting because Because of the whole UFO movement, which I think has been great in many respects, because it's brought these ideas into more of a wider mainstream context. But because the UFO movement has been so based in physical, tangible evidence of UFO sightings, I think today a lot of us, when we hear about the idea of disclosure, we're expecting UFOs to land on the White House lawn in the U.S. and the president's going to shake their hand on the lawn and broadcast this internationally. But in fact, disclosure is happening all the time. Even just what you're doing in channeling, and all the channels out there who are channeling different extraterrestrial consciousnesses, that's disclosure. Or even the videos that we're doing in the Channel Revelation show, for example, that's bringing all this ancient knowledge through extradimensional, extraterrestrial influences. That's disclosure. So disclosure is happening everywhere, but it's not happening in the way that we think, because a lot of people, when they hear disclosure, they're expecting that our governments are going to acknowledge the existence of extraterrestrials. And of course, they're trying to do that, but it may not be with the most positive intentions that they're trying to do that. Um, and I think at this stage, if a higher consciousness, extraterrestrial consciousness, was to interact with our governments, it would not happen today, because our governments are not at a consciousness level to bring that knowledge to us. So if tomorrow we see UFOs landing on the White House lawn and the president speaking to them on a broadcast news channel, we should be very concerned, because most likely they're not of the most benevolent influence. And so that's something we don't necessarily want to see happening right now. But I think all of these other things that are happening on a more higher consciousness level are examples of how disclosure is showing up today. But even still, we're seeing inklings of other kinds of information, or even the fact that the broader population is now being exposed to the idea of extraterrestrials being a real thing. Is an element of us moving toward that disclosure, even if they're not at the point of having interactions or being aware of channeling or even believing in that sort of thing. Just the fact that the broader consciousness is starting to accept the idea that we're not alone in the universe is a step in that direction. But so the experiences you're having and a lot of people are having with contact on a more extra dimensional level, and some also on an extraterrestrial level, I think are examples of that. So I see it as something that's already occurring, and something that's probably going to continue to accelerate, especially in these decades that are coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think if a spaceship lands on the White House lawn and we see ETs get out and shake the hands of our president and government agencies, we should be highly alarmed because, first of all, higher dimensional extraterrestrial beings do not want to have any involvement with our government. And I know that's a very controversial statement to make because there's a lot of channels out there that are bringing information in that's quite the opposite. And it's not that I don't believe there are extraterrestrials involved in various government, endeavors and things. But I think the ones who have our best interests in mind, who have evolved into perhaps the highest dimensions, would never involve themselves in those types of activities. And just like what you said, I think consciousness is the deciding factor as to when we might have an experience of quote unquote physical beings walking on planet Earth. Personally, in the channelings that I've done, the guides say we're not ready for that because we are magnets vibrationally and through our level of consciousness to everything that we need to know in order to ascend. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we've done something wrong, that this information has been hidden for us. We're prioritizing, or there's a system in us that's always prioritizing what we need to interact with next that's best, not only for us as a collective, but for each individual. And so if I step back a little bit, it's important to acknowledge, and I talk about the book a lot, but I think I never really explained what the book is because we're getting a lot of emails asking, where do I find the book and what's the book? I channeled a book back in 2015. It's entitled Epitime, The Anthology of Creation. Epitime is an Arcturian light language. It's a translation, in other words, of a physical term, meaning the source of all creation. And in the book, the guides start with the very beginning of time here on Earth and share the story of how multiple intergalactic races were called to Gaia to seed a new universal race. And this is a very complex story that takes a lot of twists and turns. But the point that I'm making here is that we are all extraterrestrial. So within our DNA, we are a melting pot of these ET genetics. And a lot of us are waking up to that idea as well, meaning there are certain stronger genetic predispositions that we have to one race or another, which is why we might be drawn at a certain point in our life to understand who are the Arcturians? What do they look like? What kind of messages do they share, through channels and books and things like that? There's a lot of physical synchronicity we'll run into on the plane of Earth. That's a demonstration of our level of consciousness and vibration and how our DNA is prioritizing what is important for us. So if we take that to the next highest level of the human collective, we can imagine that it's going to be quite a while, I think, because a lot of humans just aren't ready to interact with a physical extraterrestrial being. It isn't just the physical manifestation of it, I think, that is so important to consider. These are vibrational beings. And so we're exchanging vibration all the time with other humans and plants and animals. So imagine the close proximity of an extraterrestrial race being here on the physical Earth and interacting with us. They're going to be changed, of course, in order to get here and to maintain their energy and material form in this atmosphere. But we're going to also have to adjust ourselves slightly to be able to interact with them. But that's what we're doing on an interdimensional level, which I think is so cool. So when we're dedicated to a meditative practice, for example, and we're raising our vibration, it's inevitable at some point we're going to interact with something that is a higher vibrational match. And that's either coming from within us or it's coming from somewhere in the field around us. And I think this communication is so important because what they say in the book is that we as humans have very little appreciation for the amount of diversity that the extraterrestrial community possesses. I mean, imagine we might have beings with one eye or three arms or have no physical features that are recognizable to us whatsoever. But to get to the point where they could be here and we could be in a matching vibration, we first have to respect and revere our own uniqueness and our own diversity and all of the different races that exist on planet Earth, because many of the higher dimensional beings, the ones obviously who have our best interests in mind, they exist in unity consciousness. So I think that's kind of the bar, that we have to get to really in order to have these more tangible experiences. Not that people aren't already having them on ships and having physical sightings. I've definitely had both in my human experience where I've gone on ships. I've had experiences on ships with extraterrestrial beings, but I've also seen ships in the sky. And that can be a really incredible validation if you're willing to believe, which I think is also really hard for us on planet Earth.
Yeah, I think to reference what you're saying about consciousness, I think disclosure is a product of consciousness because, for example, um, our families have no concept of what we do,
Right.
right? So you're a channel and you're speaking to extra-dimensional, extraterrestrial consciousnesses all the time, yet your family, I'm sure they've seen your videos and such, but they have no concept of what it means or what exactly you're doing, right? So information or disclosure can be right there in your front of your face, but if you don't possess the consciousness to comprehend it, then that doesn't exist in your reality. So two people can be looking at the very same information, and one can be at an entirely different consciousness than the other, and that one will see things there or understand things or concepts that become real to them, where the person sitting next to them can go completely over their head. So so I think when we're talking about the idea of disclosure, we have to consider that disclosure is not a global thing that's going to happen overnight. It is an individual thing. It happens one person at a time as each person's consciousness reaches a certain level. Now, if I were to talk to my family about these ideas, they wouldn't even know, their eyes would glaze over. I mean, and even at least your family may entertain the idea. No, they don't really entertain it either.
Maybe
Okay,
a
well,
little
that's,
bit.
I mean, they at least attempt to try to comprehend what you're doing, where mine, they just can't even get that far. So this is just an example of it's right in front of them, yet they have no comprehension of it. It's not part of their reality to where you can be speaking the language, you can be using the same words that we're using here in this conversation, yet they don't even hear those words. And that's true for my family, which is even farther back than yours in terms of consciousness. And so that's the thing. It's not a right or wrong thing, but we just need to understand that these ideas of disclosure are not something that will happen globally. It'll happen an individual at a time as their consciousness reaches at a certain point, and as your consciousness continues to grow, you'll start noticing more and more and more of disclosure that was always there. It was right in front of your face, but you couldn't see it before. So it's not really a product of spacecraft landing on the White House lawn. It's really more of a product of each individual and their development reaching a certain point. If, as Micheila and I were saying, if a spacecraft lands on the White House lawn and everybody sees it, it cannot be a good thing, not at this point. Now, if at some point in the future, in our linear future, the whole of the global human consciousness on the planet reaches a high level of consciousness, then it's very possible that we may be able to interact physically with extraterrestrial beings who are walking the earth because, well, they already are here. It's just that we can't all see them or perceive them. Micheila can channel them, but I don't see them. So it's not something that I have a sensory ability to be able to do. But I understand the concepts and I do interact with them through people like Micheila, for example. So so we have to understand that the disclosure, when it does occur, it is going to happen a person at a time. And at a certain point, it will reach a critical mass where it'll start to reach the entire population of the planet, at which point the consciousness will have grown to a level where we may start to match these various higher dimensional beings. And at that point, more of us will be able to perceive them or see them in sort of a physical form, walking among us in a manner of speaking. So the ones that are out there now who may be walking among us, and this is, I think, a topic we wanted to talk about as well today, may not be entirely of that extraterrestrial genetics, or because to walk on this planet, you have to have a certain level of density, right? A certain level of vibration of a material level in order to even be physical and tangible here.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, in the book, there's some really awesome, detailed uh, passages about how the original seeders, they call them, came to the earth and how much they actually had to change in order to come here. So some of them existed in light as a part of a collective, others existed in some level of form in a different dimension, but irregardless, to come here, they were giving up an aspect of their own divine blueprint to become something else. And each of them became something completely individualized, which I think lends itself to how individualized and beautiful we all are in our own right. And that's really the origins of our diversity. But this can go awry sometimes. And we talked about this in the last channeled revelations episode where I don't want to get too technical here and get off track, but coming through portals. So we have extraterrestrial beings who are entering the earth through portals. And sometimes we are time traveling in our meditative state through a portal, and we are interacting with beings and communicating there. And there's been a lot of interesting discussion around earth portals. And I know there's a lot of grid workers and gatekeepers out there who visit these portals. They've been very unstable. And so it's hard for us to discern, and trust everything that we're hearing right now, which, is another topic that we'll get into in a moment. But I think contact itself on planet Earth today is really such a complex and interesting thing, because even though disclosure is happening individually, meaning we're all having our unique, awakenings to spirit and higher consciousness, there are times when groups of humans come together and actually witness something in the sky or are at a portal that they tend to visit and see something at the same time. And the guides are really clear. It's all about a matching vibration. So we think we just planned this destination trip to go to, I don't know, an active portal somewhere and randomly meet these other people who also see a ship in the sky, when actually there's something in our own DNA and our soul's divine plan and our vibration that's calling that collective together. So I think there are times when individuals could be standing on the street and see something that no one else around them can visualize. And then there are times that we find ourselves in a group of people where we're all seeing the same thing. And so there's a little bit of, I don't want to call it predestiny in that, but universal orchestration that's going on there, obviously. And I have a lot of people who come to me in session who have had traumatic and difficult contact experiences. And while I know, and we've talked about in past episodes, there are dark entities that are very malevolent in focus, I think a lot of these contact experiences, at least in my work and opinion, are very highly misunderstood, because we're trying to filter something that happened in a different dimension through the linear construct of mind. So oftentimes when people come to a session and they're like, oh my gosh, I had this experience on a ship and it was very tragic and I don't know what it means and I've really had a hard time getting over it, the guides will so beautifully translate it as something that our soul either pre-planned at a time in our life when we needed to have this interaction with a cosmic family, or that it's a part of our service in some way to be offering genetic information or somehow receiving wisdom that we're bringing back to the planet. There's a lot of healings that go on in that level, at that level. I know they're not all, benevolent like that, but what I find mostly is that they're either more neutral or beneficial than they are detrimental, at least in terms of the sessions that I've done. And I think all of us have had ET contact, even though we don't remember it, because we're all plasmic beings. So to time travel to another dimension and interact with an extraterrestrial, we're using the plasma in our energy field and in our bodies, which is why plasma is so extremely important. It's our telecommunication device. And so any contact we've ever had, even going back to our childhood, that we don't remember, or if we do, is the memory of it is stored in that plasma. So plasma is timeless, it's quantum. And for me, what began to happen the more I awakened and had communication with extraterrestrials is I was having flashbacks to contact I'd had as a young child that as an adult, I didn't even remember had happened. And it was so detailed. I mean, taking me back to very specific circumstances in, a childhood home with events that there's no way my mind ever could have made up. And I know a lot of people do this in hypnotherapy, for example, they want to go back and understand what happened to them, in certain context scenarios. But I think it's important if you're someone who's struggling with not remembering or having fear around something that's really hard to sort out, that both it exists in your plasma to be able to revisit again and get the details on, but also number two, a lot of those things are fearful because we're trying to put them in the construct of a physical experience. And they truly are not a physical experience whatsoever.
Yeah, I think, and I don't want to go too far down a dark alley here with this,
Yeah,
but
sure.
I think we have to also acknowledge the possibility that some of these sightings could be our own governments,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Even after World War II, although the mainstream narrative is that Hitler died in the war, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he actually escaped to South America and then onto Antarctica and set up a base there.
Yeah.
And even the U.S. military went there and apparently came back having lost because of all the advanced technology they developed there and UFO spacecraft and so on. So there's a lot of evidence or even circumstantial evidence that points to the possibility that even during the Germans developed some UFO type spacecraft. So a lot of the sightings could, I mean, that was a long time ago. So in this time that's passed since then, it could very well be that we've developed our own of some kind that are what a lot of the sightings are based on too. So we have to be careful when there are group sightings that it may not be benevolent extraterrestrials. It may be our own governments that are developing advanced spacecraft that we don't know about yet.
Yeah, I
So
totally agree with that. And, that really leans into the whole conversation of frequency. And, today, unfortunately, in today's world, there are so many man made frequency devices and technologies that are just designed for that very purpose to confuse us, to bring us into a lower vibration. And I think there can be a lot of contact from that state, right? That can be both government led, but also can take us into experiences beyond the earth that really aren't in our best interest. I feel like our true essence and our nature is to contact and communicate with beings who are loving and benevolent. But unfortunately, I think there are a lot of things that purposely get put in the way of that communication to distort it. So that's what we're dealing with on planet Earth is trying to keep our vibration high enough and our consciousness high enough in an environment that's attempting to chronically lower it to have the type of disclosure that we want and the type of relationships that we want with these interdimensional beings. And, another thing I think it's important to consider, at least as a channel, what I hear a lot is interdimensional races, they get put in all these various categories. So we think, there's the white hats and the black hats, and these beings are good and those beings are bad. But truly, interdimensional beings exist in many different forms. So even in Pleiades, for example, in the book, it describes that these star clusters are all formed around certain groups or collectives based on intention. And there are some Pleiadians who have ascended all the way to the 12th dimension, and they want to live more in a light based, non physical structure. And there are others who prefer a more physical manifestation, and neither is right or wrong. But when we're interacting with them, we have to keep in mind that they're all a little different in the type of information that they're going to offer to us and how they want to support our human and earthly experience.
I think that's interesting to discuss because that's something that we've noticed a lot because there are a lot of people who channel the Pleiadians, and I've noticed that the messages are all very different and contradictory in some cases. even the last few years. I mean, the Pleiadians you channel tend to be, their messages tend to be more positive and more optimistic, and more about self-empowerment and so on. Whereas I've heard a lot of other channels who channel Pleiadians who are very disempowering or more fear-based type of messaging. So I think that's a factor to consider, and I think a lot of people, and even myself included, in the years past, when I heard Pleiadians, I assumed they were all the same, and we were talking to the same thing. So it was a little bit confusing for a while to try to understand why do two people channeling the Pleiadians have an entirely polar opposite type of messaging. And I think that that dimensional expression is an important factor to consider, or the consciousness level, for example, is an important factor to consider, because we don't really think about, although on Earth it's easy for us to see that although we're all human beings, or at least most of us are human beings, we all have different opinions and different viewpoints, and some of us are more angry and aggressive and fight in wars, and some of us are very loving and peaceful, and would never support those kinds of things that are going on in the world. So in the same way, we have to consider that that a lot of extraterrestrial or extradimensional consciousnesses are coming from very different levels of understanding and consciousness levels, and therefore their messages are going to be very different. Some may be more lower vibrational messaging or things that are more fear-based, and others may be more self-empowerment based as well.
Yeah, it's important to consider that I don't think any race is perfect. Even the 12th dimensional beings and even the Council of Light that I work with, which is a 12th dimensional council, say we're still learning. We don't have the answers to every single question, which I think disappoints us sometimes because we really want that savior, we want the answer to every question. But consider this: we talk about the Earth and the transition that's going on here all the time. Earth is moving into the fifth dimension, which is ultimately a gateway to multidimensional energy. So if we're channeling fifth dimensional beings, which can be high vibrational and really loving, and even have a bit more wisdom than we are, we're not going to probably get the information that's truly best for us to move into that next phase of evolution, because we're a pretty close match vibrationally here on planet Earth, some of us, not all of us, to what these fifth dimensional beings already know and what they're doing. But if we go up a level, go up a notch to the seventh dimension, to the eighth dimension, we get a little bit broader scope wisdom information. And I think that's so helpful, even though I think it can be more difficult sometimes for people because we want that linear yes or no answer. And I notice even channeled revelations, you ask these very specific questions. I want this answer to this thing. And the guides will open it up and give this very broad scope, answer, which to me is pushing the boundary and the limit on our consciousness. And that's what they want for us. They not only honor that we're all individuals and need to hear things completely differently, because a transmission, communication from an extraterrestrial, it's quantum, it's vibrational more than it's words. So we're each going to walk away with something completely different, but also they would never tell us what to do. And so I think discernment has to come into the equation, and it's hard to discern in all these different experiences. We have contact, we have channeling, we have our own individual meditations and things that are going on. And discernment, I think, can be very simple. The highest dimensional guides, who are most loving and want the best for us, they honor our free will to the ends of the earth. They would never tell us that there's something we have to do, but they're always going to direct us to the most pure and powerful path. So we should feel uplifted to make very simple decisions for ourselves that are going to make the biggest impact on whatever problem we're facing. I had someone come to me the other day in session, and I hesitate to use this example. I don't want to put too much detail in, but there are a lot of extraterrestrial beings who are reaching into the Akashic records, for example, and offering prophecies about what is going to happen, what is not going to happen. And from my vantage point, the highest dimensional beings will never say something is concrete going to happen. They will say there are multiple hundreds, millions of vibrating potentials. But what they can say is in this moment, we are able to choose the ones that are vibrating the closest to your energy field. And they can do that for the collective, or they can do that for an individual. But they'll be very quick to say, your vibration can change in the next minute, and so can the collectives. So even though we're, answering your question, we're never putting it into a finite type of expression. And that is so empowering. I have people come to me who say, well, so-and-so Pleiadians, Arcturians, or my channeler told me that the Akashic records, it's just not in it for me. Whatever I want to do, it's not in my Akashic records. It's something I cannot do, or I have to do this in order to achieve that. And in my experience with a variety of different extraterrestrials and collectives, they would never say things like that. Not the ones who are evolved enough to be perhaps in the 12th dimension, or even, seventh, ninth dimension. They all say it a bit differently. But the highest dimension that you're able to reach, those beings are never going to stand in the way of what you want to do. They're going to encourage you to see it in the most expansive light possible, however, because sometimes we put such limitations on ourselves here on planet Earth. We're subject to many limiting beliefs. We have been taught to not honor our own sovereignty and our personal worth. So they want to raise the bar on that in every interaction. So I think in terms of discernment, we have to simplify. Does it make us feel better? Do we feel more empowered by the message or not?
In that context, in our last Channel Revelation show we just did, some of the topics we talked about were white hats, black hats, right?
Yeah,
and whether they exist and what their intentions are. And I thought it was very interesting the responses that we got from the various guides on that topic. And I think it speaks to that because we have a tendency as human beings to, and don't get me wrong, I like superhero films. So at least I used to before the networks went downhill recently. But anyway, we have a tendency to want to believe in and hold out for that superhero to save us from everybody, right? And I think that tendency is there even in this area. And 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when I didn't have the knowledge that I have now in these subject areas, I also wanted to believe that there were white hats that were in the world that were saving us from all the dark hats or black hats or whatever we called them. But I think in the end, and that's something that also was referenced in that last show we did, which is that we are those white hats. We are the ones who are going to have to step up and take our own power back. And I think this belief, whether, maybe there are well-intentioned people in the spiritual space who are sharing what they consider to be their truth or knowledge about white hats that are out there. But some of them may not be well-intentioned. I don't know. But I think to believe that exists, nothing wrong with the belief. But if that belief makes us not want to do anything to change the world or to change our lives to improve circumstances, then we become complacent. And meanwhile, the world continues to descend into darkness. So I think that's an important factor that we sort of addressed, which is whether white hats exist or not in the current consciousness on the planet, it's a vibrational thing. Change has to happen on the vibrational level first, not on the physical. So if, in 10 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, when I was doing all those interviews, we were talking about how the white hats were destroying all these underground bases and things like that. And I wanted to believe those things, and I had no reason to not believe those things then, because I had no reference point or knowledge at that stage. But now I've come to realize that whether those things were happening or not doesn't really matter, because it's just like the conversation we'd had on Channel Revelations about whether the UFOs were destroying the nuclear missile bases around the world or not. And the guides essentially said, well, it isn't really beneficial if they are destroying them, because the vibration still exists. So if the vibration still exists, then it's just going to pop up again anyway. Or it's going to pop up somewhere else, or they're just going to rebuild what that was destroyed. So it doesn't really change anything. So we're looking for physical changes to take place initially, but really real change has to happen vibrationally first. And if that were to happen, and that happens individually, right? It's not something that we have to wait for world leaders to become conscious enough someday to change the world. If enough of us individually start changing our vibration and start taking action in our own physical lives to make things better, then the vibration of the planet will start to increase. And as that occurs, we won't have to worry about UFOs to dismantle nuclear missiles, because a day will come when no one will build them anymore, and they'll just dismantle them themselves. So I think that's a factor to consider, that these things need to happen on a vibrational level first.
Well, it's the same philosophy as the disclosure model. When we are the conscious collective that matches the vibration of the beings that need to come or need to show themselves to us, they will. But in terms of like a nuclear weapon, we forget that we're all contributing to that. We love to point fingers at other people, but as a collective, we are creating everything that exists on planet Earth. And that's why the guides in the last transmission said, even though there may be fleets of ships that are trying to destroy these nuclear weapons, they aren't of the highest consciousness, because war is war, destruction is destruction. And they know we don't want to put any more of that in the spiral of time, because it doesn't just affect the Earth, it affects everything else in the universe. So everything that we try to destroy, even if it's for a good intention, any war that we have in our personal lives or within ourselves is contributing to the greater planetary experience. So the more we work on that stuff, the less we have to worry about how we're going to heal it all, because it is so complex. It's hard to imagine that we could live, in a world where there is no war, nuclear or otherwise. But I think that's ultimately what it's going to take. What the higher dimensional beings want for us is to remember that we are part of a co-creative vibration, the unity consciousness, the whole of humanity. Everything that we are and everything that we do is contributing to that. So we should also talk, though, about different races and their characteristics, because it's just something that I experience, which I think is kind of fun. And I know there are a lot of people out there who have their favorite ET races and cosmic families, and we're meeting so many of them these days. But, for me, the Pleiadians were first, and it was pretty obvious to me in speaking with them that I've had many, many past lives there, and got to have some experiences of what those past lives were like. But I find that every time I've met a new collective, I kind of get a feel for what their strengths and weaknesses are, what their characteristics are, what their focus is for humanity. And for example, Pleiadians, and this comes up a lot in my session work too, they seem to be really focused on emotion, and in their star system, they've studied the frequency of emotion and using it as a tool of manifestation, but also consciously processing stuck emotion and trauma and all of those things. So they feel very human in that respect, because I don't think every extraterrestrial collective works with emotion in the same way. For example, we've studied a lot in the Channeled Revelations podcast about the reptilians and how they aren't necessarily empathic beings. They're very mind focused and mind driven. As a matter of fact, they bypass that whole part of the structure that we have to create. So they're shapeshifters, they're immediate manifestors through the mind, which is where we get our very powerful creative mind, but it's supposed to be used in concert with these other parts of us. So it is interesting to me that light workers across the globe are awakening to these very special relationships with certain ET races and collectives like the Mantis, for example, the Arcturians, the Syrians. I know you've had some experience with that in your program.
What I was thinking about as you were talking about that is the reptilian consciousness is very obvious to me because I obviously am exposed to a lot of things, but then on top of that, I also follow what's going on in the world as well, and more of a physical dimension level, and that high level of mind, which is absent of emotion, is very obvious in a lot of world leaders, or even CEOs of companies. Like take Mark Zuckerberg, for example, is a perfect example. Whenever you see him speak, he's just very stoic, very unemotional, very cold, very robotic, and I think that's why we've come to idolize technology today in Silicon Valley and U.S. technological innovation. The U.S. to a great extent has a very strong reptilian influence in that sense because we have a lot of people who are CEOs of technology firms, and the U.S. is probably the most advanced in terms of the intellectual part of that. Because even though companies like China, for example, manufacture things for the U.S., the actual development of the technology, the technological innovation, a lot of it tends to happen in the U.S. And so we can see that personality difference in a lot of these CEOs, in that they have that very more intellectually based, unemotional approach. And so if you look at a person, you can see that nature in them, the tendency in them. So, but on the other hand, that's also part of all of us, right? We all have that reptilian element, and I think society has gone to an extreme in that sense, where we become very reptilian, and that's why today we idolize those kinds of things in society. We idolize a lot of reptilian concepts and a lot of, for example, our education system is very reptilian. It doesn't really honor the creative side so much. Art and music and those kind of things are sort of sidelined. Although I think the performance industry has actually become much more reptilian, even though it's performance based. So even though rather than just being more creative, it's become more reptilian as well in modern times. But in mainstream education, it's a very mind focused thing. It's not really so much to nurture the creative, emotional side of human beings. So so I think that element is very present. And if you look at person to person to person, you can kind of see in their emotional approach or to things what that is. Now, we all have reptilian in us, but we also have a lot of other genetics in us, and I think the key is to activate all of it and have it function relatively equally. Then we have access to all of these components, right? We have the emotional, because the emotional, I think, can be very powerful as well, but not when it's completely erratic and out of control. So I think nowadays people are in such extreme state of fear that emotion has sort of taken control in many respects in a very negative way. So all of those things have to be brought into harmony. But in reference to what you're saying, and having worked with light workers before, and just being around people like you and Barb and so on, I have come to sort of understand certain tendencies with different people who have more focus in one particular reptilian ray, or not reptilian, but multidimensional or extraterrestrial consciousness. So I found, for example, a lot of people who are a more Pleiadian focus, so meaning they might have come to Earth with a Pleiadian genetic as being more dominant and then becoming sort of a human hybrid version of that. They may go into fields of work just naturally that are focused emotions. For example, psychotherapists or social workers or even nurses, for example, I found over the years, when we delved into what their lineage would, what their lineage was in terms of past lives, it tended to be very much more Pleiadian. Whereas if you have somebody who's more Arcturian, I found that they tend to be more based in science and engineering or mathematics or analytical things, technological development. Inventors, for example, can have more of an Arcturian lineage. So if these are things that interest you in a particular area, for example, your focus in one particular area, it doesn't apply necessarily to somebody who may have a variety of focuses. That person may be operating with more, a variety of different lineages. But if you have one focus in one area, or one area that interests you, for example, Pleiadians are often school teachers too, right? And so, so I think that may indicate that you have a lineage to that. For example, another one I can think of offhand was the mantis. The mantis tends to be, as I recall, wasn't it more medical, or I think that's what it
Yeah,
was.
they're very medical, but especially connected to the earth, inner earth, and the soils and the microbiotics in the soils, and how that's supposed to interface with our cells and our microbiotics. And they can be very technical as well, but definitely more in the healing realm.
Right, right. They could be biotechnology, that
Yeah,
sort of
for
thing. That
sure.
was
Yeah.
something I
Yeah.
noticed
Yeah.
before. So, so one thing to look at, an easy way to sort of figure out what your lineage might be without having to go to a channel like Micheila to find out, which that's always an option, of course, is if you have interest in one very specific area, and you've worked in those areas for most of your life, then there's a pretty good chance that you are of one particular extraterrestrial, extradimensional lineage. And not to say that you've never had life experiences in other civilizations, but you may have focused in one particular area primarily and come to Earth with that, the experiences and knowledge that you accumulated in that area or with that particular collective, and then as a result, when you become a human being in a human body, you'll gravitate to those interests, and those interests may also be areas where you have some expertise, having had these life experiences elsewhere. So that's something that I've noticed, and of course you can do that with a number of the other races as well. But that's reptilian very obviously tend to be more, as I've said, well, if you're a very dominant reptilian consciousness, then you might find yourself in government or CEOs of a Silicon Valley company, for example. A lot of the world leaders tend to be more dominant in that area, and you can tell because they do things in a very unemotional, often cold way. They're not really considering the impact on other people because they don't really feel emotions. For them, it's more calculation, right? It's more a calculation of what they're doing. The repercussions on other people don't really matter to them so much. And so they can, it's not that they're burdened by the concerns over other people. It just doesn't really occur to them. It's not really something that they relate to, feeling what other people feel, empathy, for example.
Yet there are higher dimensional and benevolent reptilians. So I
True.
want to make sure that we get that into the
Right.
conversation because the ones who are here on planet Earth are a little distorted of their original blueprint, meaning, we've taken on their characteristics and they've taken on some of ours, and we've genetically modified each other in a sense. Is in all of this is talked about in the book because they initially came here because our DNA holds all of the very rich and valuable codes that they need to restore themselves after a cataclysm. And we think we're the bottom of the barrel, the bottom rung on the ladder when it comes to genetics, but that's not true at all. Actually, that's the reason why so many extraterrestrial races are not only so interested in humans and planet Earth, but also coming here to support us because a part of them exists within us. And what they want, most of all, is for that part to blossom into something even better, something brand new. And that's ultimately what we're going for. So a lot of this contact and extraterrestrial communication, it really comes from the crystalline DNA. And our DNA, our physical DNA or our carbon DNA is more related to our earthly experience and, holds the codes from our mother and our father and all of our ancestors, where the crystalline DNA is a duplicate of that in a more cosmic sense. And what the guides say is that the crystalline DNA has unfortunately been dimmed through time, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Mainly, we've just been taken away from this realization that we even do have cosmic families, or, we are interdimensional beings at our core. Even ancient history has been hidden from us. So all of that has caused us to not be able to match the vibrations of these various family lineages. And that's really changing right now for a variety of reasons. The more we cleanse and purify and detoxify our bodies, the more crystalline we become, the more those strands start to vibrate. But the key, the guides say, is we really have to make a connection between that crystalline strand and the carbon strand. In other words, we have to bring our cosmic history down to earth in a tangible and relatable way. And what begins to happen is those strands begin to find a new vibration. So the crystalline strands vibrate really high. And that's why when we meditate, we often have these time traveled and astral events because we're raising the vibration and those crystalline strands become active. The carbon strands tend to vibrate much lower to give us a tangible material experience, which is why we came. And our goal is to actually blend the two. So I think sometimes people in these conversations that are having contact can get really disillusioned and lost because the vocabulary is really out there, the terminology, what ETs are trying to teach us, it's very high level. And there's some fear about bringing that stuff into our mainstream life and conversations with people we love and business, even, for example. But in session, the guides are always encouraging us to raise the bar and to do that because that's where we fuse those two experiences together, our cosmic experience and our earthly experience. It's where they meet.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things that we've discussed in recent channel revelation show has been the concept of, as we touched on earlier, about how these beings, let's take the Sumerians in the last conversation, when they come through portals, they come through as light, as you said earlier, but they have to hybridize in some way to
Right.
exist here, right? And so that's a concept that I thought was kind of interesting, that in that hybridization process, they may take a different form than what they normally may be in. And sometimes because they're bringing through so much information, they may have a larger physical structure, like a lot of the Mesopotamian leaders that we have some history of who are depicted as being larger, or even the Sumerians who are depicted as being larger than other human beings who were there at the time. And of course, a lot of that information about giants who walked among us is being hidden by our governments. But people like Jim Vieira, who we've had on our show before and at the expo, has done a lot of research in that area. So it's obvious evidence is out there, but because that evidence would rewrite the narrative, it's all being hidden or destroyed. But clearly, there were other races in the past who had a larger structure. But as we've discussed in previous shows, the larger physical structure doesn't necessarily mean you have more information or more consciousness, right? It's, at least today, but in more ancient times that was the case. But I think that's an interesting idea that in order to walk the earth, you have to change or hybridize in some way to walk the earth, and that form may take any number of different things. Like some of the more ancient beings are depicted as having lion, or like the Syrians, for example, being lions, or other animal depictions that are sort of foreign to us today. And I think a lot of even conventional archaeological research or study suggests that these were not actual beings physically who existed at one time, or they were wearing headdresses or something like that. But the idea of that hybridization brings a new understanding that they may in fact have looked that way, but because and it's just a factor of how that hybridization takes form in the physical dimension, right? Just like we as human beings are also hybrids, right? And so maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. I know it's an area of some expertise.
Yeah, well, I think modern day hybridization looks a lot different than what it did back in the day when these beings were coming through portals. And, we can see the ancient renderings of, these hybrids that looked so completely different, had, blue skin and, multiple arms and things like this. In today's reality, as we crystallize or we activate that crystalline DNA, I think number one, we're becoming more sensitive. So we're feeling the sensitivity to our earth and to our environment. And that's a really hard thing to adjust to. And actually, in a lot of my channeling, the guides talk about these ancient technologies that the beings that hybridized and came to earth possessed. They were elemental technologies that helped them to communicate with their cosmic families beyond, to help keep up with the evolution that was going on in their own star systems, and to really help them adjust to the Earth's atmosphere. And we have some of that stuff coming back today. We have various medallions and pendants we're wearing to block out, EMF and things like that. But I think this is why, in the spiritual community, we have a lot of people who struggle more in the physical body, because the more we ascend and hybridize, the more sensitive we become, the more the vibration and the material form of our body is going to feel that much denser. And when we're meeting toxins in our environment, we are no longer going to be able to assimilate those in the same way we did before. So I've seen it both ways in session, where people come in as hybrids and they're not only more sensitive to their environment, but they also hyper detoxify. So they tend to be shapeshifters in a sense, where everything that they ingest becomes very quickly neutralized or somehow alchemized in the body. And then I've seen it the other way, where human hybrids, or everyday people like you and I who are ascending, are having a harder and harder time dealing with the body, simply because of the material reality and densities that we're dealing with here. So I think we have to really be aware of that. And the more we're aware of that, the easier it becomes to handle it. And for me personally, I've had to go more towards vibrational techniques than looking at more medical, solutions or things like that. But naturally, when you're hybridizing here into, whatever cosmic being you've been before, which can be multiple, many of us go through these multiple shifts, you're going to change your lifestyle 100%. And it can be really lonely. We've talked about this in past transmissions episodes. Awakening is no fun. It can be very lonely. And, it's inevitable when we have these cosmic awakenings, we might find ourselves in situations where we don't have a lot of people who understand us, because we're simply accelerating into new timelines and dimensions beyond what others around us have yet to experience. And that is the case for so many light workers today. It's kind of like we are raising the bar and pulling others along with us through our own personal journey.
I think one of the more interesting things that we discussed in recent shows was how it was a Channel Revelation show a few back, where the guides talked about how world leaders who are more reptilian consciousness are starting to, and of course the rest of us are, so they are more reptilian consciousness, whereas we're more human genetics, for example, or reptilian genetics, human genetics, but we've become more reptilian, and they are becoming more human. And that all of the acceleration of these world agendas having a cutoff at 2030 are because they are becoming more human, and a lot of the things that they're doing that are harming humans are starting to harm them as well. And if they don't move the world toward their agenda very quickly, then they're going to start facing more severe repercussions of that genetic transformation that's taking place where they're becoming more human. And so I would imagine that means that all the toxins and so on that are in the world that may not be harmful to reptilians, but are harmful to humans, are going to start affecting them adversely as well very soon, to where it'll have a more detrimental effect on their well-being, to where they will have to maybe not go that direction so much in the future. So I think that's was an interesting topic that talks to the genetics or the hybridization of humans and other beings on the planet as well, and how that's evolving. And I can clearly see. I mean, I think the reason why the world is so turbulent today and why people are violent or angry and there's so much unrest is because we've become so reptilian, and and that's not our true nature. And so hopefully in the decades ahead that'll start to balance out as the world leaders also start to have to deal with the consequences of becoming more human as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a period of time where we're in a war for our genetics, for our divine blueprint, which is our original genetic template, and we can see the onslaught of so many things that are working against us. But I think there's also positive signs. For example, we have to consider that the Earth's atmosphere, it's and all of the things that exist here are always going to be evaluated by any cosmic race prior to their arrival. Because even if they hybridize and they suit themselves to this environment is going to genetically change them. Just like it's genetically changing us. There's genetics and there's epigenetics, right? So we have to consider both. But the good news is we're seeing more and more hybrid children coming to the planet as well. And this is another big topic in session that we often address. And we've had our own kids program here that we've run, and we've had the privilege of working with very gifted children who there's no way they could be here unless their soul and their cosmic family had scoped out this environment and knew that it could sustain their energy, right? So I think it goes both ways. We're seeing this kind of timeline collapse of all of the reptilian activities and genetic interplay that's going on is forcing a lot of awakening. And people are coming into these awakenings very fast. And on the flip side, we're seeing the entry of some hybrid and intergalactic children who are going to pave the way for future generations. It's really a melting pot and a mix right now of all of that stuff. But if we look at from purely a consciousness perspective, what our ability is to transcend our own genetics, it's pretty amazing. And I think that's where we really need to be focused, because all the contact and communication from extraterrestrials aside, we have the power within us to restore our own bodies, to actually live beyond disease. I mean, that was seeded within us from the best of the best of the best. And so we're here to reclaim that in all ways possible. And I think it does take a balance of both physical as well as metaphysical focus. Just like we have the carbon and crystalline DNA, we have to work both angles and fuse that together in some balanced vibration in order for us to receive the benefits.
Well, I think consciousness and vibration are really at the core of everything that we talk about here, because I know that many of you have not had contact experiences, and I wouldn't say that I've had the kind of contact experiences people talk about. That, for example, Micheila talks to multiple guides in an afternoon. That's just kind of a normal thing for her, where for me that's not something that I am talented in doing. And ultimately, I don't think that's something necessarily that anyone should strive to do just to do it, because you cannot make contact with higher dimensional beings unless your consciousness supports that. So if you were to give instructions to a group of people at all different levels of consciousness on how to have a contact experience. Each of them is going to contact something totally different based on their consciousness level. If somebody is a very low consciousness level, they may contact things that are not very beneficial and could be very malevolent. Whereas if somebody's at a significantly higher consciousness level, they may contact beings of a very high vibration as well. So you have to consider that contact is going to vary from person to person, and even if the instructions on how to do it would be the same on all of them. For example, if we were to give instructions on do this and this and this to have a contact experience, that may not be equal for every person who follows the same instructions, because ultimately it's the vibration, it's the consciousness that dictates everything. And that's what we want to try to get to. And then when you get to that, whatever natural gifts will unfold. So Micheila as a channel, that's a natural gift she has. So at a high consciousness level, she will channel very high dimensional beings. But if her consciousness was low, even if she had a natural talent for channeling, she would be channeling very low vibrational beings. So the gift itself does not necessarily imply consciousness. So you can't assume that 10 people channeling the Pleiadians, for example, are all channeling the same Pleiadians or the same consciousness level of Pleiadians, which is why the messaging tends to vary so much between people who are channeling the same thing, or at least claim that they are. And just because I can't channel the way that Micheila can does not mean that my consciousness level isn't similar to hers. The gift does not necessarily come with the consciousness. Some of us are here with certain kinds of gifts and talents. Just like, for example, let's just say we have 10 people who are inventors, and they're really good inventors, and they have all invented amazing things. The one that's at a very low consciousness may invent an everyday technology that everybody uses, like, say, a smartphone, for example, where the inventor at a higher consciousness level may invent things that have to do with vibrational healing, or may operate at a higher vibrational level. And even some of the technologies that Micheila uses for healing that are vibrational in nature may be coming from an inventor or engineers who have that high consciousness level. So all of them have the same talent and ability, but the consciousness level will dictate at what level they create things. So in the same way, I may not be a channel like Micheila's a channel, but we may have equal consciousness, and our natural talents and abilities may focus in entirely different areas, as is very obvious to all of you who watch our shows. So we focus in different areas. So just because, so I would say striving to have contact experiences may not necessarily be the direction we want to go. We want to focus in areas that we have natural talents that we're here to express in this life. But we want to try to do it at the highest vibrational or consciousness level possible, so that we can use our natural tendencies and abilities in the best way that's the most beneficial for humanity and for ourselves as well.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful about contact as novelty, which I see out there all of the time, that, there are these gatherings to make contact just for the sake of, the excitement and the thrill of it. I think that can get us into trouble. I think ultimately those of us who are meant to have contact are going to have it. And how we want to have it is in the highest and best way possible. So meditation without any expectation, for me, I think, is number one. If you're meditating just for the sake of raising your vibration, it's inevitable that if you're meant to meet a specific collective or race of beings, they're going to be the highest dimensional possible that you're able to connect with. But also be careful what you ask for. I mean, those of us who are on the brink of these, really sensitive abilities, crescendoing together into something really powerful, you can ask for it and receive it in a big way. And that has happened to me. I will tell you, I sat out on my porch one morning and thought I saw a ship. I asked for confirmation. I got it. And then later in the day, I thought, wow, it'd be really cool to go on that ship. And the next morning, when I sat outside with my coffee, that ship came back and took me right up. So don't discount the telepathic communication that you have going on with these extra dimensional beings. And I think those of you who are here in this conversation know you can feel it. I mean, there's just an undeniable tingle or a sensation when you are being responded to in a way that is not physically or vocally, detectable. But something else I wanted to mention is I'm noticing a huge increase in my channeled sessions in people who are speaking light language. And if you don't know what that is, it's really just a blend of multiple cosmic languages from different dimensions coming here to somehow vibrationally uplift us or heal us or support us. And I think that's telling also, or a good sign, I would say, of where we're heading in this, ascension timeline, because the more people who are tapping into light language, it's really telling me that we're ready to receive these very, we'll say, otherworldly forms of vibrational support and assistance.
Yeah, I've noticed that too over the years, working with a lot of people in the spiritual community and a lot of light workers that I've worked with in the past, that light language has become more prominent. And it's just, I think it's a more pure expression of channeled information. Of course, it's not intellectually very stimulating because we have no idea what is being said or vibrated forth into this reality. And I think even though there are some channels out there who are able to translate that information, I think when you translate light language into human understandable language, you lose a lot because it's a vibrational transmission, right? Even what you're channeling that's in English is a vibrational transmission. And that vibration comes through even though the words are spoken. The words are just a very narrow part of that information that's coming through, right? It's just a small portion. And all the rest is in the rest that's not actually heard in English. Whereas light language, I think, is a more pure expression of that information that's coming through when people are speaking that.
And there's so many beautiful expressions of light language beyond sound. And, people are doing interpretive dance and art and, making geometries and technologies and all of these things using light language. And I really think that's the wave of the future. So contact and disclosure, just the very idea kind of diminishes, I think, the value of these relationships that we're building. We're remembering even within ourselves and then helping to flourish in higher dimensions. I think that's a good place for us to end today. Thanks for joining us again. We'll be back next week with another episode of Channeled Revelations where we bring in the guys for a full 2 hours and Ethann takes over and asks the burning questions that everyone wants to know. You can check us out on so many other platforms. We're on Spotify, Apple, Google, and many others. And we'll see you next week.